If y'all don't know who this man is, this guy's name is William J. Walker, and he holds the position as the head of the DC. Well, he was the head of the DC National Guard during what occurred back in January of last year. And it's crazy because I'm actually recording this video on the 2-year anniversary of January 6th. It's crazy how fast time just seems to fly. But William J. Walker basically came out and just said the silent part out loud or the quiet part out loud, even though it's obvious to us as black people. And I'm sure it's obvious to other people who don't want to admit it because, you know, they'll try to cry and claim that it's being woke. And that is him basically saying that the response to January 6th would have been vastly different had the people been black. He just flat out came out and he said it, which is true. It definitely would have. I mean, look at how all the people that's getting arrested and charged with something are being handled with kid gloves. And I mean some of the tiniest Mickey Mouse kid gloves you can find. So he wasn't lying in that regard. The House Sergeant at Arms, who was the head of the DC National Guard during the attack on the Capitol, told the January 6th committee that the law enforcement response would have looked much different had the rioters been black Americans. And I'm glad he said black Americans. I'm African American child of the 60s. I think it would have been vastly different response if those were African Americans trying to breach the Capitol, William J. Walker told congressional investigators in an interview transcript released Tuesday. As a career law enforcement officer, part-time soldier, last 5 years full, but a law enforcement officer my entire career, the law enforcement response would have been different. His testimony echoed the observations of many Americans, including Joe Biden, who noted the stark difference in the law enforcement response to protests in Washington following the May 2020 murder of George Floyd and the lax security at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. William J. Walker, the head of the DC National Guard during the insurrection, or as I like to call it, the invasion, also indicated that he thought more people in the crowd would have died if the mob had been largely black instead of overwhelmingly white. You know, as a law enforcement officer, I saw enough to where I would have probably been using deadly force. He said, I think it would have been more bloodshed if the composition would have been different. Walker, a former drug enforcement administration official who became the House Sergeant at Arms in April 2021, also described his personal experiences with the discriminatory law enforcement stops and discussed having the talk with his 5 children and his granddaughter about surviving police encounters as a black American. You're looking at somebody who would get stopped by the police for driving a high-value government vehicle. No other reason, Walker said. The DC National Guard was not authorized to assist at the Capitol on January 6th until after a delay of 3 hours and 19 minutes that the House committee reports pinned on a likely miscommunication between members of the civilian leadership in the Department of Defense. Can you imagine if they were able to actually get up there 3 hours early? The fact that they delayed them for almost 3.5 hours is why so much was able to happen. I'm willing to bet that if the National Guard was able to get there in time, at the time they were supposed to, a lot of the stuff that happened that day would not have happened. And I find it very interesting that whenever something goes down, when it's happening with black people and something, you know, a rising happens, that National Guard is out there instantly. Has anybody, I know people have noticed that. So, I mean, you have, when it comes to black people, you have that National Guard lined up in a row immediately. They're called. And they're lined up to avoid black people from going too far. But when it came to this, y'all put them on a 3.5 hour delay to not do anything. So that gave these animals 3.5 hours to do what they did. By the time the National Guard finally was called to come in, it was already too late. The damage was already done. The only thing they weren't successful with doing was burning the place down. Walker told investigators that it was clear to him beforehand that January 6th was going to be a big deal just from being aware of what was happening in the world. I'm an intelligence officer. To me, the intelligence was there that this was going to be a big deal. he said, citing the civil unrest in November and December when Trump supporters came to Washington. You don't need intelligence. I mean, everybody knew that they were directed to come there by the president. November was a run-up, December was practice, and January 6th was executed. I personally, William Joseph Walker, not General Walker, thought that it was just vastly different, he said, comparing the unrest of summer 2020 to the unrest after the election. National Guard is not called in December. National Guard is not called in November. And I watched on television the difference between people coming to the Capitol in November. And if you watch the film, and if these same groups came back in December, better prepare, better prepared. As NBC News first reported last month, the January 6th committee made a decision to focus its final report on former President Donald Trump, and not as much on the law enforcement and intelligence failures and other issues that committee staffers investigated. Part of the panel's investigation into intelligence failures was ultimately relegated to an appendix. Through the report did note that federal and local law enforcement authorities were in possession of multiple streams of intelligence predicting violence directed at the Capitol prior to January 6th. A spokesman for January 6th panel member Representative Liz Cheney told the Washington Post last month that committee staffers had submitted subpar material for the report that reflects long-held liberal biases about federal law enforcement, and that she would not sign on to any narrative that suggests Republicans are inherently racist or smears men and women in law enforcement. Still, the testimony of Walker, a highly decorated commanding general and a long-serving DEA special agent who rose to top leadership positions at the agency before becoming the first Black House Sergeant at Arms, underscores some of the systemic issues that went unaddressed in the committee's final report. Well, let me give kudos to this man, because even though he pointed out the obvious, he really went there, and I'm glad he mentioned, like he said, as a child of the 60s, so he was around when Jim Crow was literally at its height. It was probably getting, I don't know when in the 60s, but in the 60s, nonetheless, Jim Crow was still very much active, even though later on in the 60s, it was starting to fizzle out. So he definitely knows firsthand what that was like. And he's not lying about anything that he said. If these people were black, if this was an overwhelmingly black crowd, it would have looked so much different. I mean, think about it. Even when they see black people carrying firearms, they still get all tensed up. Remember what happened with Micah Johnson back in 2016? It was two brothers who was out there with these military style weapons, just basically protecting the people who were protesting down there. And they pulled them in from the side because they assumed that they were the ones that they were looking for. When they said, no, it's just one person we was looking for, not two. They confiscated their guns. I don't even know if they gave them an apology. I think they did at least give them their firearms back, but they didn't give an apology for putting them through what they put them through, even if it was a brief moment. Like I said, seeing black people trying to protect themselves and holding firearms still scares them, but y'all let the National Guard not do their thing for 3.5 hours when it came to dealing with those animals on January 6th, 2 years ago. That's why I said if they got really too far with this, that was going to be America's fault right there. And when I say America, y'all know what part of America I'm talking about. That would have been on them. And they know it. And they know it. Like I said, we know that a certain group of people would not have called this out the way this man did. That's why I'm glad he pointed it out. And I'm glad he called it out. And straight down the middle, no chaser. That's what you need, is more people to call this kind of behavior out. Even if it's so blatant, you feel like you don't have to call it out. We still call it out because we know mainstream media is not going to do it, at least not in the way that they should do it. So definitely shout out to William Walker for basically putting them on blast, because he's not wrong about anything that he said, despite how many people will say, oh, that's a woke argument or that's a woke narrative. We know how much they have bastardized that word woke and what it truly means. Well, we know what it truly means. And what we also know is how they bastardized it and turned it into whatever they want it to mean. But definitely this took guts for him to actually sit there and call this out, considering his position. And hopefully he'll still have his position despite him calling this out, which I'm sure he still will have it. And speaking of black people who are in law enforcement, who's there during during January 6th. Remember the black cop that shot Ashley Babbitt and unalived her? they were mad enough when they knew or found out that Ashley Babbitt was taken out. But then they got even more pissed when they found out it was a black cop that did it. Man, that man got so many death threats behind that. I'm like, y'all can't tell me what it is. But this is this is the same America where Tim Scott and even Kamala Harris said that America is not a racist nation. Remember that. If y'all watch Lisa Cabrera's video, she inserts those in there whenever she's getting ready to talk about a certain topic.